So is there a self? That's the question I want to ask. So do you think you're the very same person as you were 5 minutes ago? So when you came in this room compared to now, is there something about you that makes you the very same person as you were then? So is there some part of you that remains the same, that makes you you? In other words, do you feel there's a sameness about you over time, so that you're the same you over time? Just turn around to the person next to you, introduce yourselves, and say what you think about those questions. Okay, so now, so I'm not just asking about your sort of reflective, analytical, philosophical view on this, but if you just sort of introspect and to see how it seems to you, just if you see, you look inside and say how does it appear? Does it appear that there's a core you? There's some you-ness to you that persists the same over time, that makes you you. That's a single thing. In other words, are you indivisible in a sense? Is that how it seems to you? I'm not saying if you thought about it intellectually or whatever, but is that how it seems? It's not made of other things. There's just you in there, unconstructed. And that's qualitatively different from other things. It's not like this table, for example. This is a certain sort of thing, but you seem somehow different. There's some boundary between you, the true you, and everything else, and that true you persists unchanged because it makes you all the time. So just tell the person next to you whether you think you have those intuitions or those senses, whether or not you agree with them or not, but do you find you have this sort of feeling or sense?
If I think about myself as an
So the question I want to ask is, why does there appear to be a self? So I think, I don't know if it was most of you because I didn't ask you, but I think it's common to have these intuitions anyway. And certainly certain people throughout history and human thinking, starting no later than Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha in 2500 BC, have suggested that we do have this sense of a self, of us being a self, that is bounded from the world, that is different from the world, that is not made up of world stuff. It has different qualities to it than world stuff, and persists unchanged, that makes us us, makes us the same person over time. So there's some sense, and I don't know to what extent you sort of agreed with those intuitions completely, but probably you thought there was something like them felt true or intuitive to you, maybe in similar words as those ones. Would that be right? Does anyone want to disagree with that? So, if we take as a sort of a phenomenological given that there's a sense of self, we can say, but at least a couple of people I spoke to, since they didn't intellectually agree with the claims that were being made, they said, okay, I can see what you mean intuitively, but intellectually I don't agree with it. So if you intellectually didn't agree with it, but we have this sense, where does this sense come from? Which can be a powerful sense of us being here. There is a me here, surveying the world and able to act on the world. Whether you're a dualist or not, where does that come from? Well, I think a good place to start, and a simple point, is that a image has a perspective. So when you look at this, it seems to you that you're looking at it from a certain position. Right. So that, there's some of those buildings on the right, some on the left of the bridge, but if we were to be the other side of the bridge, that would swap around. So there's an implied location here. Indeed, you can ask people where they think they are. Where are you? I'm roughly here, but even though this is my body, I don't really think I'm in my foot. And for most people, it's sort of behind the eyes a bit and in there a bit, as if our visual take on the world was coming from a certain point just round in here. And maybe that's where you feel you are. If I said, where are you? At least there's an implied perspective point there. So every image implies a point of view from which you're seeing it. And over time, successive images imply successive points of view. So imagine this was a scene, and the reason I use Neo is precisely because of that camera work they had in the Matrix, where they scan around, and you do have these successive points of view. So imagine you're walking around this chap here, Neo, and these are the different points of view we have in successive times. Now, Edmund Husserl pointed out that when we are at a particular time, say in the middle time there, we have a particular perspective, something is happening, we call that the primal impression. but it doesn't exist by itself in our minds, even in that moment. It's a bit like if you're listening to a melody and you hear a single note. At this time, a single note is sounding. It's not as if all you're aware of is that note. That note occurs in the context of the previous notes, which are also somehow in your mind. And the successive notes are anticipated and also somehow in your mind. So the stuff that's just happened is somehow also given to you as the past, but defining a context for the present here, which you call retention. And you're already anticipating, because I'm moving this way and this is how the person is, you're anticipating your next view. You're already anticipating the future, just as when you're listening to a melody, you're anticipating the next note or possible notes that could happen. And he called that protension, anticipating the future. Quite an interesting account of this is this novel, Radiant Call, which is a novel about a murder mystery, but is also presenting a theory of consciousness, which is elaborated in the final appendix, which draws heavily on Husserl. So this current moment is this thing here. It contains the present, but also it contains within it the past as the past and the future as the future. So now when you go to the next moment, that past event is part of the retention, the past. But that past event also contains within it its past, so it's sort of recursive, you see. And then as you go to the next moment in time, this moment here becomes the past, but it contains within it a representation of its past, which contains within it a sort of a presentation of its past and so on. So what Husserl was saying was that somehow duration is given to us. We don't experience ourselves as a perspective, a point of view that's happening right now, on the very edge of infinitesimally small time of now. Right? We experience a duration. So by these psychological processes, the point of view that is given by the image becomes directly given as a duration persisting over time, and somehow you then therefore experience the point of view as the same point of view that's persisting over that duration. Even though it's different perspective points, it's somehow the same point of view because you have within it as a given that it's extended. And it's not just extended through time. By this process it's extended through time, but it's not just extended through time. The point of view is sort of amorphous. When you sort of think about what is, we say myself, or as if we owned a self, but we are the self if we are a self. It feels that myself is not just a point location. It sort of does, but there's a sort of an ambiguity there because it also seems smeared not just through time but also through space, through my body. In other words, as J.J. Gibson, I don't know if you've heard of Gibson and ecological optics, but he claimed when we see the world in terms of the actions that it makes available to us. So this lad here, climbing up the tree, sees the strawberry as reachable. It's directly given to him that this is reachable. That sort of part of... So the image isn't like a photograph, our visual image, our visual experience, being purely passive. It also engages our body sort of as part of its very meaning. This thing is reachable. This step is steppable. That car is avoidable. My son sometimes asks me, what is it like to be a dog? Because we have a dog. And I thought about J.J. Gibson, and I thought, to answer that, I just have to say, what are the actions that are given to the dog? Things are barkable at, jumpable on, waggable in response to, sniffable with the anticipation of lots of rich information about the other dogs that have that have been around. And if you spelt out all those actions and responses that are given by the perceptual scene, then that gives you a taste of what it's like to be a dog. So, the point of view becomes, by this process, extended sort of bodily, almost throughout the body. So that's perceptual states. But the same sorts of ideas apply to other sorts of states, including thoughts. I mean, to the extent that all mental states are representations, they are a sort of a take on something out there in the same way that, in abstractly, similar way as images. So if you have a thought about a rock, that rock is old, well, that's one way of thinking about that rock. But it's not the only way. You could think that paperweight is useful. And that would be a completely different take. It is, as it were, a different perspective. So thoughts and mental states, in that sense, take perspectives, even if they're not visual. So William James, in his 1890 textbook on psychology, said something very similar about thoughts as Husserl said about perceptions. Except James came first. Husserl explicitly drew on James. Well, Husserl is now more famous for that sort of approach. So James said, with the thought as it is now, is the dying echo of whence it came to us, and the dawning sense of whither it is to lead. You have a sense of where your train of thought is leading, and the context in which it came. And a sense of harmony or discord according to whether the final conclusion satisfied the emptiness it was meant to fill. So you can think the thought is now sort of congruent or the right sort of thought that you should have given the chain of thoughts that you've been having up to now. And the thought also gives you a sense of what sort of thought could come next. So an extended point of view accompanies various mental states. So just as duration was intrinsic to perception, so we can make the same arguments just about thinking generally, even non-perceptual thinking. It has an implied or experienced or given duration to it. So the point of view that you take in having a thought about something is also an extended point of view, directly given to you as having a duration. And because of a succession of such overlapping durations, the stream of thought appears continuous. And as James says, it even feels connected if it's broken by sleep. And Paul and Peter are awake in the same bed. They recognise they've been asleep. Each one of them reaches back and makes connection to just one of the two streams of thought which were broken by the sleeping hours. In other words, when Paul wakes up and the thinking processes start happening again, because of the integrative processes in your brain, naturally he connects back, well, to the same brain, right, to the thinking that was happening before he fell asleep, and to no one else's thinking. So there's a continuous stream of connected thinking happening. So there's a sense of, as James says, the parts being inwardly connected and belonging together. There's strong causal connectiveness between successive thoughts, because they're parts of a common whole. What now is a common whole? The natural name for it is myself, I, or me. So he's not saying that the self, or you, is something extra that has the thoughts. That's what he's denying. There just are the thoughts, and each thought causes the next thought. But each thought contains within it the trace of the previous thought and the anticipation of the next one. So it creates this extended coherence or duration. So even if you didn't have a concept of the self, there is an implied self through all these processes. There's a perceptual perspective, implying point of view, even within thoughts. There's a given duration to that. That perspective as the same perspective extends through time. creating a stream of densely connected states. So if we let these clouds be mental states, there is a stream of mental states which are densely causally connected in a way that are more tightly connected within themselves than with the outside world. And because of that dense causal connectedness between successive mental states, if a certain sort of mental state will bring about another one, it's likely to happen within the same stream, right? Because that stream is defined by dense causal connectedness. So now we can think of yourself at this point just as a stream of mental states. We don't need to think of a subject as having those mental states, as a self as having them. In the sense that when you think of yourself as a subject, you think you could have had other mental states. You could have had other thoughts. You could have had other experiences and still be the same subject. That's a step we don't need to make. We could just say there just is the stream. And we can get pretty far with thinking there just is the stream. And we can just capitalise on the fact that within this stream there is dense causal connectedness. And there will be in other streams as well. So if in this stream there is an intention to perform a certain action, you can predict there will, within that stream, be certain perceptual experiences. I mean, in this case, those perceptual experiences weren't anticipated, in the case of Bob, but in general, they can be. In fact, your brain does that all the time. When you move your eyes, which they dart about all the time, your brain corrects for that, so you don't see the world swimming back and forth as your eyes move, because it can predict the perceptual consequences of those actions. It can take for granted it will be within this stream, even without a concept of the self. Pin. (4413). Okay, so here's an example of capitalising on the within stream high causal density. You could say there will be the experience of the Bridge Cafe at 3 p.m. That could be a mental state happening at some point in the stream. That can bring into play various causal processes that indeed results in the experience of being in the Bridge Cafe at 3 p.m. And that will be within the same stream. It needn't at this point represent it will be in the same stream. You could just take it for granted it will be within the same stream. Because of that high causal density, if there's a certain state like the ball is red, perhaps a visual experience, it can produce another mental state acknowledging that there is the seeing of the ball is red because of the high causal density. So when you see something red, you can think to yourself, there is the seeing of something red. In fact, you could even say, in this stream there's the seeing that the ball is red. As again, without presuming a subject which could have different experiences, it's just saying in this stream there's seeing that the ball is red. So the seeing red appears as present to the stream, as part of it, because of these causal processes within the stream. And the advantage of being able to say in this stream or that stream is you could take advantage of the causal density within one stream will have an effect. So if in in this stream that is attached to a body where there's a stubbed toe and it rubs the toe, that will cause, within that stream, some pleasure. Oh, that feels better. And another stream observing that can represent seeing that toe is rubbed, and it could then predict, well, in that stream over there, there will be pleasure there, because it can take advantage of the causal density within other streams. And that being the case, we can sort of build up. So if this stream here has thought, or the intention you might say, this stream will experience the Bridge Cafe at 3 p.m, which by and large tends to cause such experiences. Another stream looking on could then have the expectation that the body carrying that stream will indeed be at the cafe at 3 p.m. And you could build this up to have something like a promise. Because this stream could then represent that that stream expects this stream to have that experience. And then it might want that stream to expect that, and understand that that stream expects that because this stream said so. And you put enough of these sort of complicated things together, eventually you get things like promising, which are all just predicated on the fact that within streams there's high causal density. And in that way, we seem to either create or discover the world of obligations and oughtness, and we ought to do this and we ought not do that. And then once we've got that, we can start telling stories. So Daniel Dennett thinks of the self as the stories we tell about the mental stream in this body, like a novel we write, where we are the star. But the we are the protagonist of the novel, the centre of attention, is like a narrative fiction. It's just a story we tell. A story that might have desired effects on other people, but also a story that the same stream can refer to itself. So that's a narrative self. The self that figures in your stories. Doesn't mean a self actually exists. It just means it's a story you tell. So we begin to model the stream of mental states within a body by this process, by the process of telling stories, and even describing to ourselves how this body will interact with the world and with other people. So we started with the notion of a point of view. Now, there wasn't really something that was the point of view. It was just implied by the mental state or the image. There wasn't like there was some real, when you saw that image before, it wasn't like there was some real point just there. It has some interesting properties from a sort of physics perspective. As you tilt the paper, the implied point of view can go through the ceiling and move at different velocities through things and so on. So in that sense, it's sort of fictional. Right? It's not the point of view that has the perspective or the image or the thought. The point of view is implied or constructed from the thought. I mean, we experience ourselves as a self that exists before our experiences and our thoughts, or somehow generates the thoughts and experiences. But maybe that's the illusion, you see. What actually comes first are just the mental states, which imply a perspective. And they apply a sort of a point of view, and points are sort of unconstructed. They're simple. We then spread that point out, but when we spread it to include something like, I'm the sort of person who believes this, I've had these experiences and this is what I own, and so on, we somehow incorporate this feeling that is unconstructed into this growing constructed self. And just as a point of view is a rather different thing from a solid object, we come to think that this extended self, as we appropriate more and more things to it, is a different, qualitatively different from everything around us. So in this model, we are an indivisible, identically persisting essence. Now you might say, yeah, fine. So you built up very, you've said a lot of words, Zoltan. All, been pretty complicated. You've just got to the point where you have a simple model of what we are, simple indivisible self. So well, that's how it is. But the point is, the model is wrong. If what I've said is right, it's an illusion, and that shows when we pose questions that cannot be answered. And the philosopher Derek Parfit has lots of examples like this in Reasons and Persons. So let's say there's just a stream of causal connectedness. Sort of part of that, we constructed a model of this indivisible self or subject that has the experiences, that persists unchanged and is indivisible. Parfit has ideas, comes up with experiments like fission experiments where you split into two, and he gives a sort of a neurosurgical account of how that might happen, like let's say your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere let's say you have an accident, one hemisphere is put in another person's body and carries on, the other hemisphere stays in this body, so you've then got two half hemispheres, both of which, let's say there was language in both of them, which sometimes happens, would have memories of being you. So which one, if any, is you? So that's the sort of experiment Parfit was thinking about. Now I looked into the sort of Tibetan reincarnation literature and found, so there is a culture that believes this actually happens. So imagine you're a Tibetan, believes in reincarnation, and there's this Lama, Jamgon Pungtrul, famous Lama, he dies. And then in the Tibetan tradition, what you do is you look for reincarnations. Now, an interesting thing is, you don't have to have one person reincarnate to just one person. Right? So Jamgon Pungtrul, for example, reincarnated into at least 5 different people. There was a fission of his stream into 5 different, where at least some of them, I don't know about all of them, I just couldn't see, but on the internet, but at least some of them have their own reincarnation lineages. Now let's say that there only was Kase Pungtrul, the others didn't exist. And let's say you did believe there was some process by which reincarnation could happen. We can say, which is the real Jamgon? Now, if there's an essence to you, there is an answer to this. If there's only Kase, then the real Jamgon is Kase, and that's fine. But if there was only Lodro Thaye, that would be Jamgon, and that would also be fine. But it continued in 5 different streams. And none of them individually can be Jamgon because that stream of consciousness divided into 5 or more, they say, actually. Another way this might happen, given you don't believe in reincarnation, is let's say your brain was exactly mapped, and then you were rebuilt. But let's say you were rebuilt in a couple of implementations of you. So then which is the real you? Well, if your brain was precisely mapped at this point in time, and then this body died, but in a new body, like in Star Trek teleportation, a new body was made, and there was just one brain and one new body, you would say that's fine, that was, that becomes the same person. But if there's 2 of you made, each of which has the memories of you, which one is you? It can't be both of you. It can't be all 5 of these are Jamgon, because Jamgon is one person, and now there's 5 people. Yeah.
If it's like copy paste, why can't they all be Jamgon? They're all copy paste, and it's all the same person. There's just 5 of them now.
Yes. if you think about yourself now, going through, what would it be like to have your brain exactly reproduced, and then, if you were, say, teleported to Mars, what it would be like if there's just one of you as you wake up and you're on Mars and you say, this is better than spaceships, I was teleported to Mars, and that would be fine. But what would it be like to you if there were two of you were made? Yeah, from a stream point of view, that's what you're saying is perfectly sensible. But from the point of view of the intuition we have of an indivisible self, there must be something that's me, or I die. It could be one dies. But if you persist, there's the illusion, the illusory self I'm talking about, sense of self, urges us to say, well, there must be an answer which one it is, and there can't be more than one. But if you just say there's streams, and there isn't a self, there's just these streams of mental states, it's fine. In fact, from the stream point of view, there isn't even a meaningful question to be asked here. So it's just like you're saying. All there is several of me, as it were, or several similar creatures. And that's it. Nothing more to be said. Any further distinctions are like saying how many angels dance on a pinhead. And there's also a fusion case I found. So there were two lamas in the past whose streams came together. So I don't know if Ergyen can remember the past lives of both of these people. But let's say he can, so he has some memories of these previous lamas. We can ask the same question. Is Ergyen two people or one? I mean, like you're saying, you're sort of saying it was not a question, really. It's not, there's no paradox here. Does Turchin still exist as a person when we have this fusion? Turchin being one of the two that became fused. Now, if our intuitive model of the self is right, there must be an answer, yes.
I'm a bit confused about how they know it's like the person reincarnated. Is it?
I mean, why the Tibetans think what they do.
Yeah, but how can they tell it's the same person just because they have the same thoughts?
Yeah, what they do is they give them tests, like they give them various objects that belong to the person, and if they select the right object, the right number, I don't know how many tests they have. Maybe there's 5 different tests of this sort, and if they select the right object each time, they say this is the reincarnation. So they think somehow the thought stream has now moved into that body, but like in these cases, that thought stream split into several, or different thought streams merged together into one new thought stream.
That just be luck if more than one person can pick the same object?
Well, yes. So that's what I believe happens, and I also probably believe that might be giving clues. I mean, do they know about experimental effects, and do you want this one or this one, and so on. So yes. So all I'm saying is, what do the Tibetans believe about it? Just as an alternative to Parfit's thought experiments, which were all about cutting up brains or recreating your brain by analysing it completely. But there is no determinate answer. I mean, do you feel there's no determinate answer? There's just, even if the Tibetans are right about these thought streams, well, there's just some streams. And same about yourself. If one of your hemispheres was put in another body and they had memories the same as you, well, there's just another stream of mental states. It's not that one is me and one isn't me. Here's an interesting thought experiment of Parfit. So now here's a face morphing into another face. And as you go through the different faces, each face has its structural integrity. But it changes gradually from one face into another. Now pick any person you wish. Who would you like to become? Just think of someone, might be interesting to become for a bit. Now imagine your brain is completely analysed, their brain is completely analysed. And then you work out how to morph it, percent by percent, from one brain to the other brain, so that it keeps its structural integrity as you go through those morphs. So you change in certain ways so that the brain still works as a brain as you're morphing it, but gradually it shifts its way of thinking, its memories, its habits and so on, from the one person to the other. So now as you go through this transition, 1% at a time, at what point do you cease to be you? So Parfit's point is there is no, because he's sort of set this up to be a gradual change bit by bit, there's this gradual shifting in the tendencies, the memories, the beliefs, the habits, the ways of doing things and so on from one person to the other. There are no sharp transitions. So it's not as if at 50% there's some sudden change to 51%. So whatever you thought you were at 50% of the morphing process, it's not as if you'd be really that much different to 51%. You'd say, so the 50% person and 51% person would say, well, really, when he gets to 51%, they'll say, well, I'm really still the same person. I might sing a bit better now, or something like that. Slightly, I think I can detect, and so on. But there was no sharp change. Now, this was one of Parfit's favourite thought experiments for himself. He said he would often return to it. Indeed, I often think about this one. And I'll come to what reaction, what effect that had on Parfit in the next slide. But I can sort of see what it means. Well, I'll quote it now. He says, "The conclusion of no self is liberating. Before I seemed imprisoned in myself." Now, this is an Oxford analytic philosopher. This is not a religious person. He's not a Buddhist or anything. He happened to come to similar conclusions as Buddhists, but not by way of being a Buddhist or even, as far as I know, even being aware of Buddhism until he developed his philosophy. So it's not often you see an analytic philosopher say these claims about the effect of the philosophy upon themselves. Well, life seemed like a glass tunnel before, at the end of which there was darkness. When I changed my view, the walls of my glass tunnel disappeared. I now live in the open air. Other people are closer. I am more concerned about the lives of others. Now I've seen this, my death seems to me less bad. So in a sense, when you think you are not... I mean, the reason why death doesn't seem quite so bad is there isn't a self to die. There's just a stream of mental states. And in principle, we could do a morphing experiment where one of us could morph into another. So in that sense, the continuation of the mental states in your stream now, in that sense, is just as good as the continuation of my mental states, because in some sense, I could have been morphed into you and then carried on as you, as it were. And that would be just as good as living. So that's a sense in which you become, I think, he feels closer to other people. You get the sense, there isn't this boundary, I was talking about the sense of self we have is this boundary between us and the world. He says, no, there isn't. There isn't a self, there isn't a boundary. In some sense, we could all be other people if there was this morphing process, which could have occurred. And then once it had occurred, it wouldn't matter if it had occurred or it hadn't, because you would just carry on being you. So, you don't have to draw the same conclusion as me, but this sort of lecture's been by way of an argument that there is no self, just a sense of self. And I also wonder if, although it seems like we want to be a self, we want to be something that persists. And ideally we'd want to be something that persists that doesn't die. But what difference would it make if there were a self and not just a sense of self? So what I'd like you to do now is, with the person next to you, to say, do you think there is a self? To answer these questions. Is there a self or just a sense of self? And if there is just a sense of self, would it actually make any difference if there was a self? Does that actually change anything? Or is it just like something empty that does nothing anyway? Just say what you think to the person next to you.